This time on I Dream of Words, we're talking about English verbs, in particular what are often called phrasal verbs. I've always had a serious problem with that name because it makes the whole thing far more complicated than it needs to be by emphasizing the fact that it is a phrase, as if it's a complete thing that can't be broken up into parts. So we're going to skip the silly version and just call them verb groups, because that's a far better name for what they are and how they work. If you're learning English, you have likely heard for a long time that the hardest thing about mastering the English language is that English, more than any other language, emphasizes these groups centered around the verb. It does, of course, but that doesn't make it difficult. I put some of the blame on students sharing their horror stories of endless hours drilling verb groups and memorization. Really, though, I blame the teachers. I've been an English teacher my entire adult life, and even before I finished school, I was helping other students learn the language. My goal, which should be the goal of every language teacher, is to make the language as simple and accessible to my students as possible. It's my duty to figure out how things really work and teach it in the most effective way. For example, English in the modern day derives from far older versions of pre-modern English. You've probably heard of authors like Chaucer and Shakespeare, the first being a 14th century writer, the second 16th century. It would be completely valid to look at their use of English and work your way through all the changes, the standardization and codification of the language, until you get to all the new words of the 20th century and gradually work up to the 21st. You'd get a deep understanding of how the language has been formed and why things work the way they do. But it's a silly, even a stupid way of learning a language. It's not that the information isn't useful. It certainly is. But it would take you an incredible amount of time and it's highly complex. Not to mention, most of it wouldn't be all that useful in a daily English setting. It's not a bad idea to share that background with students of English, but a chronological approach to teaching a language, while it seems natural, just wastes a huge amount of time and effort. The same goes for verb groups. You can take a list of verb groups and work through it. If you memorize them, you'll eventually learn how each of them functions, how to recognize it, and how to use it in your speaking and writing. It definitely works, but it works a little like learning math by rote, extremely effective at first, but not a very practical way to keep going. When you're first learning a language, you learn key phrases by heart. I'm sorry, excuse me, how do you say that in English? What's the word for this? Thanks so much. But if you never go beyond learning phrases in their complete and finished forms, you'll never be able to speak the language. You might sound great for a few seconds, but conversation is impossible. Just like if you start memorizing addition, 1 plus 1 equals 2, 1 plus 2 equals 3, 2 plus 2 equals 4, you'll always be able to remember the answer, but as soon as a new situation comes about, you won't know how to approach the problem. Verb groups are the same. If you just memorize them, you'll seriously have to learn hundreds before it's useful, and even then it's so easy to mix them up. There is, however, a far easier way to deal with it. And this is why I have such a problem with the name phrasal verbs, since learning them as phrases, set patterns, is exactly the source of all the difficulty. What we need to do is think about concrete and imaginary meanings. That sounds incredibly complicated, but it's not. I should probably start out for those hardcore linguists out there by saying that these are not technical terms. You can use terms like literal and metaphorical for them if you want to get fancy, but the meaning will be the same and those words have lots of details that I simply don't want to get into and won't help this process, which is intended to be as straightforward as possible. Let's take an example that has nothing to do with verbs that you probably have used before. Animals. Think for a second about two animals, a puppy and a lion. A puppy is, of course, a baby dog, and it tends to be associated with being cute, soft, gentle, and friendly. A lion, however, is a huge animal, powerful and aggressive, strong and fierce, completely without fear. So what do those look like in their concrete and imaginary meanings? I just met Linda. She's a lion. I saw Shannon on the road. They're a puppy. These two pairs of sentences are very basic English. If you find them complicated, learning about verb phrases might be better to wait until you've gone through some of the more basic constructions. I'll assume this is no problem though and keep going. The first sentence in each pair sets the scene. The speaker is encountering someone or something that's named, in these cases, Linda and Shannon, two common names in English. The second in each pair, however, uses the most basic English sentence construction of all, subject plus be plus description. You can call this a state sentence, since it's not describing action, just how things are, their state. If you take these in their concrete sense, there is a lion named Linda, and the speaker has just met her, and is describing to their friend the experience. There is a puppy on the road named Shannon, and again, the speaker is describing the encounter. These are perfectly sensible understandings for these sentences, but they are probably not the most common ways to interpret them. Far more commonly, those words are used in their imaginary senses. Lion signifying someone who is strong and fearless, puppy someone who is cute and gentle. Linda, in that meaning, is a person whose overwhelming characteristics of being strong and aggressive are being described by the speaker. Shannon is being described as cute and friendly. These are completely sensible understandings of these sentences too. Context will tell you which meaning is correct in your particular situation, but it shows something very important. You already know how to interpret English meanings, whether they're concrete, the actual lion and puppy, or imaginary, the characteristics of those animals being applied to people. Prepositions work the same way. First, we should look at how a verb group works. The simplest English sentences are constructed of subject plus verb. The subject does the action, and the verb is the action the subject does. Two slightly more complicated versions of this are the basic building blocks of nearly all English: subject plus verb plus object, and subject plus verb group. In a lot of ways, you can just think of the object as part of a verb group, and they become the same thing. Actually, just about all English can be summarized by saying that it is subject group plus verb group. That's how the language works at its most basic level. Verb group isn't a technical term in common usage. It's a phrase that I use to mean a verb and its attached words, and many other teachers have also chosen to use it, rather than the more technical language that often gets people, especially advanced language students, into a lot of trouble. Just keep in mind, though, that if you look it up, you might find various different meanings and explanations for it, and that could be confusing if you think they're all being used the same way. That shouldn't be too much of a problem, as long as you remember that different teachers and students will define it differently, so when you read someone's material, make sure to check to see how they're using their terms. We're going to ignore the question of the subject group, and you can take a look at a discussion of that if that's something you want to work on. I'm just going to use basic subjects. The subject group is the entire subject. People, or the dog, or the beautiful photograph would all be subject groups. Even my sister's best friend who lives 2 streets away would be a perfectly valid subject group, but we're going to keep them simple so the explanation can focus on verb groups. The verb group is the verb and the words that attach to it. This can be a verb standing alone or a multi-word verb like will go or have seen. It can include prepositions or adverb like run fast or cleaned out. It can include objects like read books or take a walk. In many cases, it will include more than one of these at a time. English is like a jigsaw puzzle. You can build sentences using these pieces and just add to them without really having to change much else. Most languages work that way, but it's easy to get overwhelmed as more pieces get attached, so it's best to remember that it's easily manageable blocks that get joined together, not complicated constructions that need to be thought of all at once. What is commonly talked about as a phrasal verb is just a verb group that includes a verb, a preposition, and, optionally, an object. This could be clean up or get out, ask about something, or talk about someone. There is nothing special about these verb phrases, though, and they exist in all modern languages. Their construction in English is nothing unique or complicated either. Most languages build these phrases in the same way, using a verb and a preposition. Some languages call words that function in this way particles, and the difference for this purpose doesn't really matter. And optionally, an object. What makes English different is that these phrases are extremely common and they are used much more often in English without objects than probably any other language. That doesn't need to be either complicated or frightening, though, since the structure is something you're already comfortable and familiar with in whatever language you already speak. There's no need to add extra complexity where none really exists, just because it's slightly unexpected. I'm going to use a verb that functions in various ways to illustrate a simple example, the verb speak. This isn't a particularly special verb in English, although, like most of the language, it doesn't follow a regular conjugation pattern. That doesn't matter, though, to understand how it works in a group. Thankfully, English verb conjugation is independent of the function of the verb in the rest of the sentence. 1. I speak. 2. I speak English. 3. I speak to my friend. 4. I speak about the weather. 5. I speak of the past. 6. I speak in riddles. 7. I speak for myself. The simplest subject in English is I, a single-letter pronoun. It's used here for that purpose, to keep things simple, but you can assume that this works for any subject, whether one letter, one word, or a whole line long. In 1, the meaning is very clear. The subject is speaking. That is, they are saying words out loud. In 2, the subject is joined by an object. An object, in its simplest explanation, answers a question. For a direct object like this, the question is, what is the subject speaking? The answer is English. There is nothing complicated about this sentence. It is completely concrete, literal. The subject is speaking the English language. That sounds very simple. But there is a little more to it, depending on the context. The subject might be speaking English, or they might be saying something quite different. They might be telling you, not that they are doing it at the moment, but that they have the ability to speak English. This would be like saying, I can speak the English language, or I have the ability to speak in English. That is a less concrete version of the same sentence, but it's no less easy to understand. I'm sure you already knew both meanings this sentence could have, so you're already used to both the concrete and imaginary forms of speaking in English. In 3, the simplest understanding is that the subject is currently speaking and the object in this case, my friend, answers a different question. Not, what are you speaking, but who are you speaking to? The less directly concrete version of this sentence isn't so much about being able to do something, as to was, but about doing it regularly or frequently. I speak to my friend certainly can mean that the subject is currently doing the talking and the friend is listening. It can also mean, however, that the subject often speaks to their friend. Both meanings are common and understood in regular spoken English, and even basic learners usually have no trouble knowing which is meant, depending on the context. What we have here, though, is a verb, a preposition, and an object, what many people think of as the dreaded and complex phrasal verb. As you can see, though, it's just a verb with a preposition added. The preposition, and its object, like my friend in this case, gives an answer to the question, how is the verb done? If you think of it in that way, it's far less difficult to see why it's there. It would be silly to say, I speak my friend. Since your friend isn't a language or a word, you can't speak them. The to answers the question, what is the relationship between speak and my friend? To put it more directly, are you speaking to your friend or about your friend? To is answering the question of relationship, and this is what prepositions do. They clarify the state of the relationship between two other words or phrases. You can take a look at the video on English prepositions to go into more detail about different prepositions and their often varied meanings, but I will assume that you have a good understanding of prepositions and keep looking at how they link verbs to ideas and objects. In 4, the same verb has been used, with an object, but the preposition is different. Now the preposition is answering a different question. What are you speaking about? The important part, though, is that the question is defined by the preposition. We have gone from what are you speaking to who are you speaking to what are you speaking about, just by changing the preposition. The structure of the sentence hasn't changed, though, and the entire meaning of the sentence stays the same except the relationship defined by the preposition. This is the important part in all of this, and I hope at this point it's beginning to be clear. If you change the object, of course, the meaning wouldn't be different. I speak about the weather is no different from I speak about the past or I speak about my parents. The object changes, but nothing else about the sentence has shifted. In the same way, you can change the verb and the meaning is not altered. I talk about the weather or I chat about the weather would have the same meaning. Of course, speak about, talk about, and chat about are often listed as different verb groups. But once you've understood the way that speak about works, as long as you know the meaning of talk and chat, you don't need to learn them separately with the preposition. They just fit into the same pattern. The only thing that really shifts how the sentence is understood is the preposition, so learning the prepositions and the verbs that go with them is a far less stressful and complicated way of looking at verb phrases, as you can already see. In 5, you can see an even better example of how this works. The preposition has changed, but the meaning has not. To speak of something and to speak about something is no different. Much like the overwhelming majority of English, there are many ways to say the same thing, and choosing one is about personal preference and style, not one being more correct than another. The only difference between using speak of and speak about is which one a particular English speaker is more likely to use, and that's all about individual speaking style. In 6, we have potentially moved into a more imaginary understanding of the sentence. You could read this in 2 ways. The more concrete version is that the subject is speaking riddles, actually telling the listener questions with confusing or surprising answers. The more imaginary version is that the subject is being intentionally confusing, and the effect on the listener is the same as listening to riddles. The preposition in is describing the manner of speaking in this case, rather than the content or location. I speak in the spring, or I speak in the bedroom, would use the preposition in its completely concrete, locational sense. This is why it's so important to understand that the verb and preposition are not somehow linked in any permanent manner. It is in riddles, in the spring, and in the bedroom that have a meaning when put together. Speak is only the action that takes place. How it happens, what is spoken, and where it occurs are answered by the preposition and its object. If you try to learn every possible meaning of every verb combined with every preposition, you'll be there years and still be confused by new and changing ways English is used. These changes happen all the time and are often faster than the learning process. Understanding the basic building blocks like a preposition and its object, though, means that no matter what verb gets attached, you can quickly figure out the meaning. In 7, this point is even more clear. The meaning is similar to 1, but the emphasis has changed. The subject is speaking, but wants to make it obvious not just who is making the noise of the words, but who has constructed the ideas that they are communicating. In this sentence, for myself is answering the question, are you speaking for someone? Or perhaps more simply, when you are speaking, do you represent someone else or just your own thoughts? You can, of course, also speak to yourself, by yourself, and at yourself, meaning that you are having a conversation where you take both roles, speaker and listener, that you are alone when you are speaking, or that you are directing the words at yourself, as if you are two different people. Usually, in the case of the last one, it would be like in the case of a person reprimanding themselves for having done something wrong, or teaching themselves a lesson. We have now taken a look at how a verb group is built. It's just a verb with a preposition, often with an object, but it's neither as complex nor as difficult to remember as is often applied when the subject of phrasal verbs comes up. This is the first in a series of videos about English verb groups, but it is the most detailed explanation. The rest of the series will go into the meanings of specific groups of verbs and prepositions. It won't go into it in the same way other teachers often do, though, going through a list of verbs and then looking at the different prepositions you can use with them, as if it was a list to memorize. I will actually take it from the other direction and look at the prepositions and how they have come to link up with their verbs. This way, if you understand the meaning of the preposition, you will be well on your way to having a clear way to figure out how the verb relates to it without all the slow rote learning. That means far faster understanding and more time saved that you can use to actually practice your speaking and reading. As always, thanks for joining me. Until next time, I hope your dreams really are full of words. See you.